Welcome to Side of Science.
With Stacey and Clinton, because every story has a side of science.
On today's episode, we are talking about whether size matters, aging and cancer, supersizing your animals, shrinking insects, thank goodness, and pretty sheep. Hi, Stacey.
Hi, Clinton.
I have been looking at Instagram, which I know is never a good thing, but I was not driving and I wasn't operating heavy machinery at the time. So I came across a post about the Greenland shark, and the post was telling me that it is the oldest living vertebrate animal on Earth.
How old? What do we know?
Well, according to Instagram, it said that it was, I think, about 450 years old. But what I've been reading and looking at a little more closely is that they roughly sit at around 200, 250 years old, which is still the oldest living animal. But also their age can be estimated to be in a range of 150 years,
Wow.
which is a big gap.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they would feel if you're like, oh, you look 300 today. I'm actually 150. It's not a great thing. A few other facts about the Greenland shark before we talk about why we're talking about its age is that it's also gives birth from the ripe age of about 150 years old.
Oh, wow. That's a long time to wait for, women at 35, it's considered a geriatric pregnancy. So imagine, what is it at 150?
At 150, it's a teen. Yeah. So it's a teen mum. It's Greenland shark is a teen mum at 150 years old. So, but what I wanted to talk about today is, you raised this with me when I mentioned the Greenland shark, is Peto's paradox, which we're going to get into, but is really relevant to animals as they age.
Yeah, so Richard Peto was an English statistician and an epidemiologist, and he reasoned that if every cell has a small chance of becoming cancerous, then an organism with 1,000 times more cells should have 1,000 times more cancer. But it doesn't. So when you think about the size of Greenland sharks, they don't just have bigger cells. Organisms have more cells the bigger they are. And so more cells, there's more opportunity for mutations to develop, which can lead to cancer. Because cancer is essentially uncontrolled cell growth. So, it's really interesting that we can see these animals that essentially live for so long and don't seem to develop cancers.
Are there other examples outside the Greenland shark? Like, surely it's not the only one.
No, and the reason I sort of came across this paradox was because they recently found that elephants have a particular gene. We also have this gene. So the gene is for a tumor-suppressing protein, and you'll have a copy from your mum and a copy from your dad, and so will I. And this helps cells when they divide. It helps recognize possible outliers, cancerous cells, and it will induce them to commit suicide or apoptosis. So those cells will be gone. But in elephants, they actually have 20 copies from mum and 20 copies from dad. So they have so many more opportunities to recognize those potential cancerous cells and get rid of them and suppress any tumor growth, a lot more than humans.
I wonder if there's a part of that then relates back to the Greenland shark, because I'd also read that the Greenland shark has about 70% of its genome is duplicated. And is much higher than other sharks. Basically, more of their genome or their genes are dedicated to DNA repair.
Right. Okay, yeah, so that's a big thing. So the genomic stability will help with recognizing those mutations, preventing mutations. And the interesting thing about the Greenland shark in particular, like if we separate it out from the elephant, is where they live. So they live in freezing water and they have a lot lower metabolic rate. So they're actually doing everything on a much slower scale. So everything's slowed down. So that includes the amount of cell division. That will be slower too. And so that helps prevent cancer in itself.
Do we see that in, like, how much of that is a factor then in other animals where we're seeing this observed as well? Like elephants, for example, aren't living at, 0 degree water. and they're perhaps moving a lot more than the Greenland shark is. So, how does that relate to those animals?
Yeah, there's a lot of theories going around as to why there is a paradox. And part of it is the elephants have these genes and the metabolic rate is less of an influence in preventing cancers. Part of it is the size itself. So if we think about a 4-gram tumour in a rat, for example, that's...
Its head.
Yeah, right? That's big. But if I have a 4-gram tumour, it's less noticeable. If an elephant has a 4-gram tumour, not such a big deal, right? So there's that part of it. And then the other thing that I came across, which was really interesting, is this idea of hypertumors. And so maybe there are some animals who are getting cancers and their cancer gets cancer.
Oh,
so
that took a moment for my brain to process. Yeah. Their cancer is getting cancer. Is that because the cancers are so big, or the animal's so big?
It's not ever been seen in humans, but it's this idea that's sort of come from this paradox that perhaps there are cancers that are growing and they're sort of insignificant in terms of the size of the animal, but that the cancerous cells, some of them can go rogue and start uncontrolled cell growth that's not part of the original tumour, and then monopolise or compete with the original tumour, which means that neither of them are getting what they need in order to grow. So they kind of suppress themselves in a sense.
That's wild.
Yeah, that's quite mad. And so perhaps that's another reason that these organisms that we would expect to see cancer, we're not necessarily seeing them suffer or die from cancers.
So you've mentioned, we've mentioned the Greenland shark, we've mentioned the elephants. Are there other animals where this is really noticeable for, either size or relative to other animals of the same size that are kind of reinforcing the paradox?
Not necessarily size, but I think age. Tortoises live for a really long time, and so they've managed to develop or find a way in which they're also able to survive without cancers, but they're certainly not as big as elephants and Greenland sharks. So, yeah, there's a lot of theories around how or why, but I think now that we know about the genetics of the elephant and having these copies, and you were saying about the Greenland shark's genomic stability as well, these organisms have developed or evolved separately from one another to actually live long enough to survive cancers or to not get cancers. And I think that's tied to, or there's definitely a correlation between that and the age at which, or the length of pregnancies. So the age they fall pregnant or the length of pregnancies or how many offspring they're able to have. Does that make sense, like in the time frame?
Yes. So what you're saying is that, let me check, because they live longer, there's more time that they're able to bear young?
It's more in the sense that because they have to wait 150 years to pass on those genes, and if we think of it as that's the goal, evolutionary speaking, the survival of the fittest is to pass on those genes, then the animal needs to survive long enough to do that, to pass on those genes. If you're a rabbit, for example, then you can almost reproduce very early on, have lots of babies, and then you could get cancer and die very, very early. There is no reason. Evolution doesn't care, so there's no reason to kind of protect your cells because you've already passed them on. However, these larger animals, like I think an elephant's gestation period is something like 22 months, and then they have one baby. So the organism has to have developed or evolved to be able to pass on those genes. And part of that must be something to do with preventing cancers.
Which means that they are effectively, by surviving that long, their body or their genome is kind of optimized potentially for survival, meaning then that obviously gets passed on to the next generation, and then over time they're just getting essentially stronger or more adapted, just living better, longer.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we see in dogs, for example, a lot of them are selectively bred. And they're selectively bred for cuteness or pedigree dogs for certain coats or certain traits. Breeders don't necessarily breed for longevity. And so we see that if an animal or a dog, is over 10, they are very likely to then get cancers and die. That's how long they kind of live for. And in that time, they'll have had litters and puppies and whatnot. If we wanted them to live longer, to develop that, they'd have to develop these mechanisms, and then likely their reproductive strategies would be different.
And the dogs is an interesting one because they go against Peto's paradox in that the bigger dogs you would expect if we're following Peto's paradox, would expect to be less cancer prone than, say, like a golden retriever, I think I read, has some of the highest rates of cancer versus, say, a very, very cute pug, which has low, can't breathe. Maybe that's a different problem.
Yeah.
But dogs seem to be one of these species that actually runs counter a bit to Peto's paradox.
I think it's interesting. I looked into this as well, and I found that medium dogs have the highest prevalence of cancers. And so your really, really large dogs are likely dying of something else before cancer can take hold. And then those little dogs, that depends too, whether the brachycephalic breeds, so the shortened nose breeds, whether they have other problems first, then, cancer obviously isn't going to come up because something else has got them instead. So, yeah.
And you made the point that the way they're bred, and particularly purebreds, there are a whole lot of other things going on where they're trying to get certain genetic makeup that is maybe counter to longevity. It's much better to look pretty for a few years and win the dog show than it is to live to 12.
Exactly, yeah. And there's always going to be some sort of trade-off in evolutionary terms. I have pedigree cats, and particular breed that I have, Persians, can be really prone to polycystic kidney disease, which is horrific. And so now that breeders have been aware of this for some time, they're often genetically tested, and then you'll breed those that don't. But you can't really test for cancers and things like that. So, there's always some trade-off.
Should we talk now about cancer itself then and what it is? Because I think it's important to understand this conversation. I want to understand what is actually happening in this. I understand there's the cells, it's division of cells, but what's going on to cause the mutations essentially?
So in a single cell, then that cell will replicate its DNA and it will replicate everything inside the cell.
This is for just normal growth.
Yep.
I'm just
growth
and repair. I'm growing new hair, more fingernails.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, I've got a cut on my palm and that will heal up because of this process. So those cells will replicate everything inside them, look a little bit like a figure eight as they sort of develop or multiply, and then it'll pinch and then it'll divide into two cells. So that one cell has become two. In that process, there are checkpoints to make sure that the DNA has been replicated, that all the organelles are there, so the organelles that produce energy and protein synthesis, they're all there. But it can go wrong. And so when these cells start to get older or they start to get sick, then they can commit, or they should commit, cell suicide, which is apoptosis. And so chemicals will induce that and then they'll degrade. So cells don't live forever and they're not supposed to. But if something goes wrong with a checkpoint or they start to grow uncontrolled, then you have what we call cancer. Makes
sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So we've been talking a lot about size, and we've talked about Peto's paradox. We've talked about mutations in cells, which ultimately lead to cancer. I want to come back to the size point, though, because something else I came across was
Cope's law.
That's what I came across.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's okay.
So what is my understanding in a nutshell is that this is a theory, a bit like the paradox, but this one's a bit more straightforward, is that animals effectively get bigger over time.
Yeah.
And we're talking evolutionary time, not just from zero to
from
10.
Birth to
Right, because that would not be really a major scientific breakthrough. You will get bigger as you age. No, this is different.
Yeah, you're right. So if we look at the fossil record, you can see that horses were a lot smaller than they are now. And I guess we've observed this in other animals too. I think dinosaurs as well, it certainly got larger over time.
Like they needed to.
Well, yeah, and why, right? I guess that's partly because there's an evolutionary advantage to these animals to be larger. So in horses, they can run faster. And evolution's not a design process. It's more of a tinkerer. So if you look at the fossil record of a horse's leg, all the bones are exactly the same. But what happens is they all, their toes sort of get fused together and their bones get longer over time. And so this leads to longer legs, and then you have a larger animal, which can run faster. So there's the advantage. And so this happens over a long time.
So if there's an evolutionary advantage to being bigger, why do we still have small animals? Why do we still have pugs? Why aren't they 6-foot pugs?
Well, partly because that would be really strange, wouldn't it? Could you imagine? So they're not actually bred for that pugs are selectively bred. But in terms of natural environment, the advantage to be bigger needs to be there. So in the case of horses, if you can run faster, there will be an advantage because you can escape predation. But it also depends on where the horses live. So there's a couple of interesting things. One, penguins, as an example. So if you go down to Phillip Island, you'll see these cute little fairy penguins, and they're like 30 centimetres, quite small. If you go to Antarctica, you'll see 4-foot penguins, like big emperor penguins. And they're much larger due to these evolutionary adaptations to their environments. So here we're seeing Bergmann's rule. So animals in colder climates tend to be larger because a lower surface area to volume ratio helps them conserve heat. So all of the animals in Antarctica are really big or have developed some way to lower their surface area to volume ratio to maintain warmth. Whereas down in Phillip Island, in comparison, it's a lot warmer, and so the animals can be a lot smaller and they'll lose a lot more body heat, but that's okay because they can survive.
It'd be like going out on a summer's day in 5 fur coats, like
Right.
overkill.
Yeah.
Like the penguin's like, I don't need this.
Exactly.
So then what you're saying is the environment is playing such a big part in terms of the evolution of these different species. And in some situations, it makes sense to get bigger. And in some situations, it makes sense to stay the same. Are there animals that are getting smaller?
Yeah, so this is another interesting one because when you think about a cold climate, you think a bigger animal. But last year, I actually went and visited St Kilda in Scotland. So this is a remote island off the west coast of Scotland, and it was inhabited for a really long time. But in 1930, no running water, no electricity. They actually voted to just get off the island, and they've all now moved off. So you can go and visit, and what's really cool is to see the village that was there and also these native birds and sheep. These particular sheep have actually evolved to become smaller, a process called insular dwarfism. And that's because the island actually has limited food resources and fewer predators and harsher climates. So instead of getting bigger to keep warm, they've actually got smaller so they don't need to eat as much and can survive. So they have this really beautiful fur and they're quite pretty looking for sheep.
I'm glad you qualified that.
Yeah, they're cute. But they're actually shrinking.
So what we're seeing is that it's really going to depend on the environment and the survival of that species ultimately, which is, I guess, what the whole thread of what we've been talking about, from the Greenland shark to the sheep, and this role of size is really just a factor of evolution.
And I do love my charismatic megafauna, but if we go the other way, insects have gotten smaller as well. So when dinosaurs were around, there was huge insects. And I'm glad they're gone, to be honest, because it's frightening the size of some of them. And that's because, the reason they've shrunk is because there's less oxygen in the environment now. And the way that insects get oxygen into their bodies is a passive process, so it doesn't require energy. It's diffusion. And so diffusion is where the gases will move from an area of high concentration into a low concentration and move through the cells. And so because there's less oxygen, they can't actually get enough oxygen to support more cells. And so they cannot be larger. They're kind of limited now and also because if they were larger too, they'd have a problem with their exoskeleton and survival. But yeah, that's the reason that insects, thankfully, are getting smaller.
Thank goodness we don't have giant flying 6-foot mosquitoes anymore, because I don't think there's enough.
Could you imagine the fly swatters?
Imagine the amount of raid you'd need to put on you. Well, I think they'd be putting on raid to keep us off at that point. Yeah. What does this all mean? Size. Does size matter?
Does size matter? I don't know if it's really actually got to do with size. I think evolution doesn't necessarily design with blueprints. It just cobbles together what works well for survival and for reproduction. So, and that's in a specific environment and time. It doesn't aim for perfection. There's always going to be trade-offs. If your strategy is to live fast and die young, and reproduce, then cancer doesn't matter. So it won't prevent problems like cancer if they occur after reproduction. And that's why we see these strange, imperfect traits and why we see these kind of contradictions in different organisms.
I do have one more fun fact on the Greenland shark before we wrap up, that it does contain in its body a chemical called trimethylene oxide, or TMAO, which is a compound that helps the shark survive or manage living at very deep part of the ocean, in a very deep part of the ocean. But if the meat is not treated correctly via fermenting, as it is in Nordic countries, that it actually has the effect of making you seem drunk.
Oh, wow. Wow. I have a couple of problems with this. So are you saying they're eating Greenland sharks, and when they eat them, they get symptoms of being intoxicated?
If they haven't treated it right, and yes, they are eating 400-year-old sharks from the ocean, which we won't judge, right?
No judgment.
But no judgment at all. But
would you try it?
I don't know. I don't think I could.
I'll try anything once. Wow.
Guilty.
Yeah.
There you go. And it has led to an expression in Norwegian, at least, of being shark drunk. So
shark drunk.
Avoid getting shark drunk.
Yeah. That's a new excuse anyway.
Yeah. I don't know if it blows up in breathalyzers. Like, I had shark. I had shark, officer. It was not a beer. But it could be a fun way to bring this into the classroom, which is how we want to tie this up. So how could we talk about the Greenland shark and Peto's paradox and all these size-related scientific concepts in a classroom?
Yeah. So I think obvious ties are right through biology. So cells and body systems, understanding the body is made up of cells that grow and divide, and cancers for disease and immunity in Year 9. Year 10, genetics and inheritance. We talked about genome stability. Also evolution in Year 10. A lot of that underpins all of what we've spoken about today. VCE biology, especially Year 11. And then you could also maybe go into ethical considerations of eating 400-year-old sharks and have that discussion. Year 9, energy and systems, so energy transfer that supports life. We spoke about that sort of stuff as well. And I guess that would also tie out to VCE physics, Unit 1, thermal physics, energy transfers, efficiency, and thermodynamic principles as well. And then maths, so scale factors, volume, surface area relationships, and real-world concepts as well. So, yeah, quite a few things that you could use some of the examples from today.
It's a great entry point as well, because students or children are always going to be interested in animals, right? The biggest animal, the smallest animal, how are they so big? Why don't we have giant insects flying around? Like, what a great kind of hook to start the lesson.
Yeah, and I guess that also ties out to kind of atmosphere. So there's earth science and stuff in that, and how that's changed over time, and then the impact that has on what can survive. Yeah.
Plenty to cover off, all from the Greenland shark, and thank you, Instagram.
Thank you, Instagram.